Imagine a boy who has lost all hope in life and the appearance of a dog who never gives up on him. Watch how Mona, a loyal golden retriever, helps Edward take his first steps towards a new life. "This is Mona," Edward's grandmother said, her voice soft but hopeful. In her arms was a golden furred bundle of life, a golden retriever puppy full of energy and love. She knelt before Edward's chair, gently placing the puppy on the ground. Mona wagged her tail and sniffed at the boy's feet. "Happy birthday, Edward. She's here just for you." Today is Edward's 6th birthday, but unlike the bright and lively parties of the past, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of 2 long years of silence. John and Mary exchanged a glance, filled with the unspoken question. Could this be it? Could Mona be the one to break through the walls Edward had built around himself? It wasn't that they believed in miracles. Not exactly. But in the quiet corners of their hearts, they held onto the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, this little creature could bring back a flicker of life to their son's world. But Edward didn't smile. He didn't reach for the dog. His eyes remained hollow, barely flickering with any recognition of the gift before him. He turned his head slightly, as if retreating further into the shell he had built over the years. The once energetic boy 2 years ago, now frail and distant, sat quietly in his chair, his eyes reflecting the void that had grown inside him. Outside the window, the world moved on. Children laughed, cars passed by, and the sun set with its usual brilliance. But inside the house, the air was thick with the tension of hope and despair. John and Mary, his parents, had held on to hope longer than most could understand. They had tried everything, therapists, doctors, new routines. Yet nothing seemed to reach Edward. He hadn't spoken a word in months, and his interactions with the world had dwindled to mere glances. The accident 2 years ago had left more than just physical scars. The laughter and joy had been stripped from his small frame, along with the ability to walk. Now Edward was completely paralyzed in both legs. Over the next few days, Mona tried. She approached Edward cautiously, her golden fur brushing against his legs, as if she understood he needed time. She would sit beside him, her big brown eyes watching him with patient understanding. At times, she'd gently paw at his sleeve or nudge his arm with her nose, asking for nothing more than a response, a connection. But Edward would flinch. His small hands would push Mona away, not harshly, but firmly enough to keep her at a distance. It was as if he was afraid of feeling, of connecting. The dog's presence seemed to stir something inside him, something that he wasn't ready to face. John and Mary watched from a distance, their hearts breaking a little more each day. Every morning, they would see Mona try, and every evening they would see Edward retreat further into his own world. His silence had become a fortress, impenetrable and cold. The once warm and lively home now felt like a place where words and laughter had no room, replaced by quiet, uneasy footsteps and whispers of what could have been. But Mona didn't give up. Each day, she returned to Edward's side, laying her head on his lap, even though he never petted her. She would pull gently at his shirt, as if inviting him to follow her, to step outside into the world again. There were moments when Edward's eyes would flicker with something, perhaps a memory, perhaps a longing for the life he once had. But it was always fleeting, and just as quickly as it appeared, it would vanish, leaving behind only the shadows of what once was. Time moved slowly in the house, as did the hearts of John and Mary. They began to wonder if Mona had been a mistake. Was it too soon? Was it too much to ask of their son to connect with something, even something as gentle and patient as a dog? The thought gnawed at them, late into the night, as they whispered to each other in the dark, their words laced with uncertainty and fear. "He's not ready," John would say softly, staring at the ceiling. "Maybe we rushed this." Mary would lie beside him, her hands clenched in the sheets, her mind replaying the same thoughts. "But what if she's exactly what he needs, John? What if we just give it more time?" And so they waited. Mona waited. And Edward, in his silent world, continued to drift further away. The house, though filled with life from the puppy's gentle presence, still felt weighed down by the unspoken burden of grief and unfulfilled hope. Every day they hoped for a change, but every day Edward remained trapped in the darkness of his mind. The house had fallen into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft padding of Mona's paws across the hardwood floors. Months had passed since the golden retriever had come into Edward's life, and yet the boy remained as closed off as ever. His small frame, once full of life and energy, now seemed to shrink further each day. He rarely spoke, rarely lifted his eyes to meet anyone's gaze. Even the sunlight that poured through the windows couldn't seem to reach him anymore. He had built a world around himself, a fortress of silence and solitude that not even his parents could penetrate. Mona was always there, though, a loyal shadow trailing behind Edward. Every morning, the dog would sit by his side, her large brown eyes watching him with a quiet patience. She would nudge his hand with her nose, wag her tail in hopeful gestures, or sit on her haunches, just waiting. But Edward gave her nothing in return. He barely acknowledged her presence, as though the connection that was supposed to form between them was simply beyond his reach. It was agonizing for John and Mary to witness. Each day felt like a struggle, an endless loop of watching and waiting for a breakthrough that never came. They had clung to the hope that Mona, with her gentle heart and warm eyes, would somehow reach Edward in a way they could not. But weeks turned into months, and Edward remained locked away in his own world, retreating further into himself. At the dinner table, John would glance at Edward, his eyes filled with worry. Mary, usually the first to break the silence, would often try to start a conversation with their son, her voice soft. "How was your day, sweetheart? Did you and Mona play at all?" Edward would only blink, offering no more than a shrug or silence, his focus on the plate in front of him, as if the words his mother spoke couldn't pierce through the fog that surrounded him. John and Mary's conversations, once filled with warmth and laughter, had turned into long, quiet exchanges in the dim light of their bedroom. They were worn down by hope that seemed to fade with each passing day, replaced by the creeping fear that they might never see their boy return to the bright, joyful child he once was. The weight of that possibility was almost unbearable. Every failed attempt to reach him only added another layer of doubt, another crack in their fragile hope. Still, they couldn't quite let go, not completely. Occasionally there was a flicker, a fleeting moment when Edward would glance at Mona, his eyes following her as she bounded across the backyard. He never spoke or moved toward her, but in those rare instances there was a glimmer of something in his expression. It wasn't joy, not yet, but perhaps curiosity, or maybe even longing for something he couldn't quite name. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it would vanish. Edward would turn away, retreating once more into the safety of his silence. One afternoon, the air in the house felt especially thick with tension. Edward sat alone in his room, surrounded by the quiet clutter of his toys, though he didn't touch any of them. Mona, restless, paced by the door before padding softly out of the room and down the hallway. Moments later, Edward heard the faint creak of the front door opening, followed by Mona's excited bark echoing from the yard. For the first time in months, something stirred within Edward. The sound of Mona barking, so full of joy, so alive, pulled at his curiosity. He shifted slightly, craning his neck toward the door, listening intently. What was she doing out there? Slowly, almost hesitantly, Edward slid off the bed. His legs, still weak from disuse, wobbled as he pulled himself across the floor, inch by inch, toward the source of the noise. When he reached the doorframe, he hesitated, peeking around the corner. Through the open door, he could see Mona in the yard. She was darting back and forth, her golden fur catching the light as she chased after a small red ball. Her barks rang out in the afternoon air, carefree and full of delight. Edward watched, transfixed. He hadn't seen something so simple, so joyful, in a long time. It stirred something deep inside him, a memory of a time when he could run and laugh and play just like that. His heart beat a little faster. The house had been quiet for what felt like years. Edward had retreated so far into himself that not even the softest, most tender words from his parents could coax him out. But something stirred that afternoon. Mona's persistent barking was usually an annoyance to Edward. The shrill, repetitive sound would cut through the stillness of his room, making him turn his head to the wall, his arms instinctively pressing the pillow tighter around his ears. But today, it was different. The barking, oddly enough, felt less intrusive, more alive. It was as though there was a playful rhythm behind it, a beat that stirred something deep within him. He turned his head toward the slightly cracked door, curiosity tugging at him. He hadn't left the confines of his room for more than a few minutes in a long time. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the carpet, hinting at a world beyond the four walls he had imprisoned himself within. With a slow, deliberate movement, Edward shifted from the bed, his hands pressing against the cool floor as he lowered himself down. The effort felt strange. It had been so long since he had moved with intention, so long since the thought of exploring something, anything, had crossed his mind. Mona's barking pulled him further, calling him from the quiet solitude. Outside his room, the door to the backyard stood slightly ajar. He could hear the soft thud of a ball being tossed in the yard, followed by Mona's gleeful barks as she darted back and forth. The sound was light, joyful, almost musical in its own way. Edward found himself crawling toward it, his movements slow and awkward, his breath uneven as he drew closer to the open door. When he reached it, his heart gave a sudden, unexpected leap. There was Mona, her golden fur catching the sunlight as she darted across the lawn. She was chasing a bright red ball, her tail wagging furiously as she leapt into the air, catching it between her teeth with practiced ease. She bounced back on her paws, tossed the ball back onto the grass, and repeated the joyous routine all over again. For the first time in 2 years, Edward felt something crack inside him, a memory, a flicker of life. He had played on that very lawn not so long ago, chasing balls, climbing trees, his legs propelling him through the grass, the wind brushing past his face as he laughed freely into the air. Now, watching Mona play, that same feeling surged through him, overwhelming the stillness that had long gripped his heart. His hands trembled slightly as he inched forward, pulling himself past the threshold of the door and onto the porch. The breeze greeted him warmly, rustling his hair. It felt good. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was a spark, something alive in him again, something that had been dormant for far too long. Mona must have sensed his presence. She stopped mid-chase, her head turning sharply toward him. Her large brown eyes locked onto his, and for a moment they simply stared at one another, boy and dog. Then, in one swift movement, Mona bounded toward him, her entire body radiating joy. She stopped just inches from his feet, her tail wagging so vigorously that her entire body swayed with it. Edward couldn't help but smile, a tiny, hesitant smile that felt foreign on his face, but right at the same time. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and took hold of the ball. Mona sat obediently, her eyes wide and eager, waiting for him to throw it. And so, with as much strength as he could muster, Edward tossed the ball forward, watching it roll unevenly across the grass. Mona shot after it, her tail a blur as she caught it and raced back to his side, dropping it at his feet, ready for another round. Edward laughed, softly at first, then louder. The sound startled him, but it felt good, freeing even. He threw the ball again, and each time Mona fetched it, her excitement only seemed to grow. From the kitchen window, John and Mary stood, their hands frozen mid-task. They had come to expect silence from their son for so long that the sight before them now felt like a dream. Edward, sitting on the porch, his face alight with laughter as he played with Mona. It was a scene they had prayed for, but never dared hope would actually come to life. Mary wiped at her eyes, unable to stop the tears from falling. "Look at him, John," she whispered. "He's laughing. He's really laughing." John's hand gripped hers, his own voice thick with emotion. "It's like he's coming back to us, Mary." They watched as Edward, their Edward, found his joy once more. Just a boy and his dog, under the wide open sky. On a warm sunlit day, Edward sat by the window, watching the sun as it dipped low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the yard. After that afternoon on the lawn, when Mona's playful sprints across the grass had stirred something long buried in Edward, a change had quietly begun to unfold. It wasn't immediate, nor was it sudden. Like the slow growth of a tree pushing its roots deeper into the earth, Edward found himself reaching, tentatively at first, toward something he had nearly forgotten: the joy, the connection. And Mona, ever patient Mona, was the one who had opened that door. At first, the shift was small, almost imperceptible. Edward began by simply acknowledging Mona's presence. She would sit at his feet, her golden fur gleaming in the soft light, her eyes watching him with quiet understanding. Sometimes she would press her wet nose against his hand, and instead of pulling away, Edward let it linger. There was something soothing in the gentle way she approached, never demanding more than he was willing to give. It was Mona who taught him how to let go of the fear, bit by bit. He started talking again, not much at first. "Mona," he whispered one evening as she lay curled beside him. The word felt strange on his lips, like it belonged to someone else. But Mona responded instantly, her head lifting, her tail wagging just slightly as if to say, "I'm here." He hadn't expected the flood of warmth that filled his chest then, hadn't known how much he had missed simply saying another's name, feeling a presence that cared. The more he allowed Mona in, the more Edward began to open up to his parents as well. They noticed it, of course, the way he answered their questions now, not with silence, but with short, thoughtful replies. And eventually, as the days passed, those short replies grew into longer conversations. There were still moments when he retreated, when the weight of the past 2 years pressed down on him too heavily, but the moments of light were becoming more frequent. With Mona by his side, Edward found that he no longer dreaded waking up in the morning. Instead, there was something to look forward to. Their time together in the yard became a daily ritual. Every afternoon, he and Mona would go outside, where Edward would throw the ball as far as he could, and Mona would dash after it, returning triumphantly with her tail wagging. There was a rhythm to their play, a kind of unspoken understanding. Mona never pushed too hard, never expected more than Edward was ready to give. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It wasn't just Edward who changed. His parents, John and Mary, felt the shift in their home as well. For so long, the air in their house had been thick with sorrow, every corner of it reminding them of the son they thought they had lost. Not physically, but emotionally. Edward had withdrawn so deeply into himself that it was as if the boy who had once filled their lives with laughter had vanished. But now, with Mona's quiet companionship, something new had begun to take root. The laughter wasn't back yet, but there was a softness in Edward's eyes they hadn't seen in years. And more than that, there was hope. Hope. It was a fragile thing, like a candle flame flickering in the wind, but it was there. John and Mary clung to it, nurturing it carefully, afraid to breathe too deeply lest it be snuffed out. But as the weeks passed, the warmth in their home grew stronger, steadier. Mona had brought with her a kind of light that none of them had expected, a quiet, enduring presence that seemed to say, "It's going to be all right." Mona wasn't just a dog to Edward. She was the symbol of his recovery, the embodiment of a hope he hadn't even realized he was searching for. With every wag of her tail, every look from her soft brown eyes, she reminded him that he wasn't alone, that life, no matter how broken it seemed, could still hold joy. And for the first time in 2 long years, Edward believed it too. The sun hung high in the late afternoon sky, casting a gentle glow over the backyard. It was one of those perfect, tranquil days, the kind that made everything feel lighter, as if the world itself was taking a deep breath. Edward sat on the edge of the lawn, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His legs were folded beneath him, but he paid them little mind now. Mona, the golden retriever, with her golden fur gleaming in the sunlight, was chasing after a small rubber ball Edward had tossed just moments ago. Her tail wagged furiously, her tongue lolling out the side of her mouth as she bounded across the grass, her joy infectious. From the open kitchen window, John and Mary could hear their son's laughter spilling into the house. They exchanged a glance, both of them pausing in their busy preparation of the evening meal. It had been too long since they'd heard that sound. The last few months had been filled with small victories, like watching Edward open up again, his once silent world, now filled with the laughter and chatter of a child who was slowly beginning to remember what it felt like to be happy. Mary wiped her hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, looking out the window at the scene unfolding in the yard. "He looks so happy, John," she whispered, a small tear escaping from the corner of her eye. John, still chopping vegetables, nodded. "Yeah," he replied, glancing up, his voice soft. "It's been a long time since we've seen him like this." There was a pause, and in that silence, they both allowed themselves to believe, for just a second, that the worst was behind them. That maybe, just maybe, Edward was on his way back to the light. But peace is a fragile thing. It started suddenly. Mona's soft, playful barking turned sharp, urgent. Her body tensed, her posture shifted. She darted to Edward's side, circling him in quick, frantic movements. The change was so sudden it sent a shiver down Mary's spine. "John, something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling now. John looked up sharply. Mona's barking was no longer playful. It was a warning. Without another word, they both rushed to the back door, Mary's heart pounding in her chest. They ran across the yard, their feet pounding against the earth, and when they reached Edward, the sight before them made her heart seize. Edward was lying on the ground, his small body convulsing, limbs jerking uncontrollably as his eyes rolled back into his head. Mona was by his side, barking relentlessly, her nose nudging him as if trying to bring him back from whatever dark place he had fallen into. John froze, his breath caught in his throat, while Mary dropped to her knees beside their son, her hands trembling as she tried to hold him steady. "Edward!" Mary's voice cracked, her fingers gripping his shoulders, but he didn't respond. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted, as if struggling to breathe. John fumbled with his phone, his shaking hands making it nearly impossible to dial the emergency number. Panic gripped them both, the peaceful afternoon suddenly shattered by this nightmare unfolding before them. Mona's barking didn't stop. She was frantic, her paws digging into the ground as she paced around Edward's still convulsing form, her eyes wide with fear. It was as if she understood the gravity of the moment, as if she could sense the very life of the boy she had come to love slipping away right in front of her. "We have to get him inside," John shouted, his voice filled with desperation. He bent down, carefully lifting Edward into his arms, his son's body still twitching uncontrollably. Mary was right behind him, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps as they hurried toward the house. Inside the house, the tension thickened, pressing in on them from all sides. John paced, his phone pressed to his ear, pleading with the emergency operator to send help faster. Mona sat beside the couch, her large brown eyes never leaving Edward, her tail tucked tightly beneath her. Her body shook slightly, as if she could feel the tension in the room, the suffocating weight of not knowing what would come next. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, Edward's body stilled. The convulsions stopped. His breathing slowed, and for a moment there was silence, terrifying in its stillness. The sirens wailed through the silent evening as the ambulance sped down the road, its lights flashing in rhythm with the thudding hearts of John and Mary. Edward lay motionless inside. His parents sat beside him, their hands trembling, hearts constricted by the familiar fear that had haunted them ever since the accident. But this time the terror felt more real, more immediate. Edward's condition had been unpredictable. They had no idea if he would recover from this. In the chaos, neither of them had noticed Mona. The faithful dog had barked, howled, and ran alongside the ambulance as it pulled out of their driveway. For as long as her legs would carry her, she kept pace, her deep brown eyes fixed on the back doors, as if willing them to open and take her in with Edward. Mona's paws pounded the pavement, her breath heavy with the strain, but she didn't stop, not until the ambulance had disappeared from sight, swallowed by the distance. Alone on the side of the road, she stood there for a moment, then turned and trotted toward the hospital. Inside the cold, sterile walls of the emergency room, John and Mary sat in anxious silence. The doctors had whisked Edward away the moment they arrived, leaving his parents clutching one another in the waiting area, the weight of uncertainty bearing down on them. The hours dragged on, each tick of the clock echoing like a cruel reminder of how little control they had over their son's fragile condition. Edward's life, once filled with boundless energy and laughter, had been reduced to moments like this, waiting, hoping, fearing. Finally, the doctor emerged from the emergency room, his face serious but not grim. "Mr. and Mrs. Walters?" he called softly, pulling off his gloves. John stood, his legs feeling weak beneath him, while Mary gripped the arm of the chair for support. "Your son suffered a severe seizure. Given his condition, it's not entirely surprising, but the severity. It's concerning." The doctor's voice was steady, but the gravity of the situation hit them both like a blow. He paused, then continued. "We've stabilized him, and his vitals are holding for now. We need to run some tests. But I'll be honest, it could be linked to the trauma his body has endured over these last 2 years." Mary's knees gave way, and John caught her just in time. Her mind spun, searching for answers that she already knew didn't exist. Is he going to be okay? Her voice was barely a whisper, the question laced with desperation. It's too soon to say, the doctor responded, his gaze softening. But we'll do everything we can. Hours later, as the night deepened, Mary found herself wandering the hallways of the hospital, her mind adrift in the fog of worry. That's when she saw Mona, sitting patiently near the hospital entrance, her golden fur dimmed under the harsh lights, but her eyes bright with determination. Mary gasped. How? Mona's tail wagged slowly as she stood up and padded toward Mary, nudging her gently with her nose. Mary knelt down, tears spilling from her eyes as she wrapped her arms around the dog. Somehow, in the midst of all the panic and fear, Mona had found her way here. Her presence was like a balm, soothing some of the unbearable weight on Mary's heart. You knew, she whispered into the dog's fur. You always knew. When John found them, he was just as astonished. She must have followed us, he muttered in disbelief. Mona had been the one to alert them to Edward's condition in the first place, her frantic barking drawing their attention to their son just in time. Without Mona, they might have been too late. As the days passed, Mona became a fixture at the hospital, never straying far from Edward's room. Nurses whispered in awe about the dog's loyalty, allowing her to stay close, sensing the bond between the boy and his canine companion. A week passed and Edward's condition slowly stabilized. The doctors ran test after test, monitoring the delicate connections between his nerves and muscles. Then, one morning, there was a faint but hopeful sign, a slight twitch in his legs. It was small, almost imperceptible, but to John and Mary, it was everything. The doctor's tone was cautious, but the glimmer in his eyes revealed what they all dared to hope. There was a chance. He's showing signs of improvement, the doctor confirmed quietly. It's still too early to say, but it's something. For the first time in what felt like years, John and Mary allowed themselves to hope again. They watched as Mona lay quietly by Edward's side, her head resting near his hand, as if waiting for the moment when he would wake and reach out to her once more. The days following Edward's seizure were filled with a quiet kind of dread. The air in the house felt heavier, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. John and Mary sat through countless medical consultations, listening to doctors explain the delicate balance Edward's body now needed. The seizure had shaken them all, physically, emotionally, spiritually, but it also ignited something new in them, a determination to not let fear win. The doctor's words echoed in their minds long after the consultation ended. We need to adjust his treatment plan, the doctor had said firmly, her eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. There's no cure, but there are ways we can manage this. We'll start with changes to his medications and include physical therapy. His body needs to relearn what his mind already knows. John had squeezed Mary's hand tighter at that moment, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Edward's road to recovery wasn't just about surviving now, it was about regaining something more, something Mona seemed to understand before anyone else. Weeks turned into months, and every morning the routine began the same. Edward, now 7, struggled with the exercises, his body stiff and reluctant to cooperate. Mona was always there, lying patiently by his side, her golden fur a soft beacon of comfort. She would nudge him gently, her large brown eyes filled with an understanding that seemed almost human. At first, Edward would scowl, frustrated with his own weakness. He hated the way his legs shook when he tried to stand. He hated how he couldn't just move like before. But every time he faltered, Mona was there, her tail wagging slowly, as if to remind him, "I'm here. We're in this. Together." And slowly, Edward began to find comfort in her presence. The therapy sessions, which had once felt like battles, became moments of shared effort. Mona would run after a ball, bringing it back as if to encourage Edward to keep trying. Her loyalty never wavered, and Edward's trust in her grew. There was something unspoken between them, a quiet partnership that pulled him through the most difficult days. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting therapy session, John and Mary sat on the porch, watching Edward and Mona from a distance. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, but Edward was determined. He was standing, hands gripping the arm of the therapist, his legs shaky but holding firm. Mona, as usual, was close by, watching him with unwavering attention. She had this way of sensing his needs, when he needed space, when he needed encouragement, and when he just needed to rest. "I never thought we'd see this day," Mary whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She leaned into John's side, her heart full of the kind of hope she had once been afraid to feel. "Look at him, John. He's standing. He's moving." John's throat tightened as he watched their son take a few more shaky steps. It wasn't much, just a few feet across the grass, but it was everything. "He's getting stronger," John said, though his voice cracked slightly. "It's a long way from running, but it's a start." Mary nodded, wiping away the tears that had begun to blur her vision. I never thought Mona would make this much of a difference. I thought we were fooling ourselves." John smiled softly, resting his chin on the top of her head. "She's not just a dog, Mary. She's his friend, his protector. I think she's done more for him than any of us ever could." As the months continued, the bond between Edward and Mona only deepened. Every day brought new challenges, but Mona was there to help him navigate them. Whether it was something as simple as a trip to the garden or as daunting as a full therapy session, she was by his side, a constant and gentle presence in his life. The little boy, who once wouldn't even touch her fur, now couldn't imagine a day without her. For John and Mary, Mona had become part of the family in ways they hadn't expected. There were days they found themselves relying on her just as much as Edward did. Her loyalty, her calm energy, her silent reassurance. She was, in many ways, the glue that held them all together during the hardest moments. One evening, after months of grueling therapy and slow progress, Edward did something that left his parents speechless. He let go of his therapist's arm and, with Mona at his side, took 3 small, unassisted steps across the lawn. The look of concentration on his face was fierce, and the determination in his eyes was stronger than ever before. Mona wagged her tail excitedly, staying close but never crowding him, her eyes shining with something that looked an awful lot like pride. John and Mary stood by, watching with tear-filled eyes as their son, once paralyzed by fear and trauma, began to move forward, both in body and spirit. The path ahead was still uncertain, full of obstacles they couldn't yet see. But as they watched Edward take those small, brave steps with Mona by his side, they knew they were ready to face whatever came next. Together. And that's the inspiring story of Edward and his loyal dog, Mona. As you can see, sometimes the most miraculous moments come from the smallest steps, just a few wobbly steps on the grass, with a faithful companion by your side. Mona wasn't just a dog. She was the light, the hope, in Edward's difficult journey. If you've ever gone through tough times but found hope in the simplest things, share your story with us in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss more heartwarming and meaningful stories like this. Let's spread love, companionship, and hope to those around us. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.